Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and following up on my video breaking down the Principality of Edelond, I'm here to cover the other faction added to the newest version of the Last Alliance Total War, the Kingdom of Lothlórien. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2, set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.3.5 alpha, progressively getting closer to a full release, currently having more than a few factions that are campaign ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Kingdom of Lothlórien before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Lothlórien is an ancient elven kingdom founded by the Nandarin elves to the southeast of the Misty Mountains in Khazad-dûm in particular, located in the forests of Lórien. Many Sindarin elves coming to join the elves of Lothlórien in the Second Age, to the point that the king of the area was the Sindarin elf Amdia. As the Second Age continued, this most fair of elven kingdoms would include among its ranks Galadriel and Celeborn, although Lothlórien would lose a large amount of its strength in the War of the Last Alliance when Amdir, refusing to accept Gil-galad as High King, would lead his warriors to ruin, Amdir dying and rule of Lothlórien being bestowed on his son Amroth. In the middle of the Third Age, Amroth would attempt to make the journey to the Undying Lands in the west, abandoning Lothlórien and dying at sea, control of the kingdom falling to Celeborn and Galadriel, the wielder of one of the Elven Rings of Power. For millennia, the Golden Wood of Lothlórien was protected by the powerful magic of Galadriel, up until the War of the Ring, Galadriel and the Galadrim supporting the Fellowship of the Ring in their quest, although when their kingdom was repeatedly assailed by the forces of Dol Guldur, until the Elves of Lothlórien brought the fight directly to that dark fortress of Sauron, destroying it just as Sauron and his One Rings were destroyed. With the destruction of the One Ring, the power keeping the Elven Ring strong disappeared from Middle-earth, meaning that Lothlórien was consigned to fade out of history as its elves depopulated the kingdom, travelling to the west. Lothlórien doesn't appear in The Hobbit, be it the book or the films, but does appear prominently in the Lord of the Rings books, being a place of reprieve for the Fellowship after the horrors of Moria, a role likewise shared in the film adaptations, although in those, the Elves of Lothlórien are also shown fighting alongside the Rohirrim in the Battle of the Hornburg, something that doesn't occur in the books. With the release of the Rings of Power TV show coming up and its focus on Galadriel, I'm almost certain that the Elves of Lothlórien will get a lot of screen time. In terms of culture this may have inspired the Kingdom of Lothlórien hidden in the trees, I can't think of any one-to-one examples, but the idea of biblical, earthly paradises seems to be an idea that rings true when thinking of the Golden Wood and its seemingly eternal splendour. With the history of the faction both in and out of universe looked at, let's look at its units beginning with its generals. Unlike in the Dawnless Days where generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having two generals, the Kingdom of Lothlórien also having two general options. The first of those two options are the Galadriel Bodyguard, a general unit that is also shared by the Principality of Edelond. Looking at these elves, they wear helmets reminiscent of the ancient Greek Corinthian helmets, but with spiky crests that bring to mind the Witch King's helmet. For body armour, they wear a scale hauberk with the riders split for some reason, with pauldrons to protect the shoulders and vambraces and greaves for the forearms and lower legs, a hooded cloak capping off their look. Strapped to their back, they have a large round shield that's rimmed with metal and enamel, designed to look like a leaf. While the shield somewhat reminds me of a hoplon, hoplons weren't rimmed with metal, though the large shields used during the migration period occasionally were, although enamelling on shields designed to see combat rather than ceremonial purposes is a bit suspect. For weapons, they have flanged axes at their side, while their main weapons are recurve bows, specifically the bows of the Galadriel made from the magical wood of the Malorn trees, giving these warriors amazing range and power. Looking at the unit officer, he's identical to his men but wears a breastplate with a gilded tree on it over his scale hauberk, while his helmet has a more ornate crest on it. As a unit, these guys are your budget option, being amazing archers who are also fairly capable in melee, although cavalry is a menace to watch out for. I'd recommend using these guys specifically in sieges where their extra firepower makes them that much more useful. Moving on to the next general unit, we have King Amdir himself leading the Galadrim King's Guard. Looking at his bodyguard, they're almost identical to the previous unit, except that they all uniformly wear gilded breastplates that instead of axes at their side, they discard shields and have Dane axes slung on their backs, combined with their bows making these guys ranged shock infantry. Looking at Amdir himself, he's identically equipped to his bodyguard except for his helmet, which has a crown built into it to show off his regal status, the crown looking somewhat similar to those worn by the Numenorians. As a unit, these guys are essentially the boosted version of the Galadriel bodyguard, going from elite archers to shock infantry in a second. This means they're a more offensive unit than the previous one, but also means they're not quite as good when put on the defensive. Despite that, I'd have to say that these guys are the unit that I'd recommend due to the fact that this faction relies on guerrilla warfare and ambushes more so than the other factions, so having a unit geared towards offensive pushes makes more sense. With these guys covered, all the general units of the faction have been looked at, so let's turn to their spearmen, beginning with the sole spear unit this faction has, the Galadriel Spearmen. Another unit shared by Edelond. These troops wear the same helmet seen on previous units but in a more basic style. Their torsos being protected by a mail shirt while their forearms and shins have vambraces and greaves, leaving their upper legs somewhat vulnerable. In this case, however, their shields make up for this weakness. The shields being reminiscent of the kite shields used during the High Middle Ages by people such as the Normans, as well as the shields of the Celts used in antiquity with their cut-out designs. Overall, this shield actually resembles the metal shield used by the Noldor Elves of Lindon, which goes to show off the gap in technology and power between both groups of elves, even the most elite warriors of this faction having lesser armour than that worn by the professional troops of Lindon. Returning to this unit's shield, it's rimmed in metal, which is something that is seen on kite shields, so that's a plus for accuracy, while the shield is also painted with a white malorn tree on it, which is a nice touch, emblems being a common sight on shields. Turning to their weapons, the elves use polearms that resemble glaives and naganadas, the weapons being useful for both stabbing and slashing foes. The unit officer is essentially identical to the warriors in the Galadriel bodyguard, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit's role. These guys are a critical component of any Galadriel army, as the faction's only spear unit, meaning they're critical in warding off horsemen, who would otherwise destroy your archers. This unit is competitive only really up into mid-game army builds, as in the late game it's severely outmatched. However, because this faction's focus is on building massive spear walls to grind down enemy forces, the unit suffices in its role as a support unit to counter cavalry. Moving on to the next unit and the next category of units, melee infantry, we have the Galadriel clan warriors, also seen in the Edelond roster. These warriors are extremely lightly armoured, wearing mostly their robes for protection, having only vambraces and helmets for protection, which is a great deal better than nothing, all of them having more basic helmets, which is a nice touch. For shields they use small pear or leaf-shaped bucklers, while for weapons they use one-handed flanged axes, such light equipment being in common use in the 12th and 13th centuries, by warriors who couldn't afford extensive armour and expensive weapons. Looking at the unit officer, he's equipped like a Galadriel spearman with an axe and a buckler. As a unit, these guys are a key component of your early game armies, being the main core of your strength, capable of fighting toe-to-toe with most beginning rabble, although once tougher foes enter the fray, these guys are in trouble. The main strength and use for this unit is in ambushes from the tree line against unsuspecting columns of light infantry, but again, open battles against more skilled foes should be avoided at all costs, as should horsemen, who can tear these guys apart. Moving on to the next unit available, we have the Galadriel Wardens, who have helmets, greaves and vambraces we've seen before, with their torsos being protected by scale shirts, using the same flanged axes in combination with more ornate metal-rimmed and decorated bucklers bearing leaf designs. Looking at the unit officer, he's just a Galadriel bodyguard with axe and buckler, so we'll jump to the unit's role. In battle, these guys are a mix between mid-game and professional infantry, being an imperative unit to get for late-game armies even if they are still lacking against the heavy infantry fielded by other factions. Their best use is really to buy time for your archers to tear apart formations, after which these guys can make progress in cutting down the survivors. Overall, an integral unit, but by no means the best available to the faction. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Galadriel Shock Troops, who are Galadriel spearmen who have decided to discard their shields and spears and instead dual-wield axes. As I've said before, dual-wielding wasn't a common thing on the battlefield, but was recorded as happening, axes being as good a weapon as any to dual-wield. These warriors are excellent as ambushing troops, being invisible on the map until they join combat with the enemy, making them perfect at launching raids on enemy forces, massed hordes of them being quite the nasty prospect to have to fight against. These guys' playstyle is exemplary of the faction strategy, being to hit enemies hard and fast, and bring about quick resolutions to battles rather than sticking around and having a slugging match. Overall, a massively useful unit that I suggest using en masse if you want to play this faction the way it's meant to be played. Moving on to the next unit, we have a unit that only appears in this faction's roster, the Galadriel Amdia Guard. Equipped identically to the Galadriel bodyguard when it comes to armour, these warriors use axes in combination with large, roughly rectangular shields similar to Pavisa's. The shields being rimmed with metal and decorated with engraved metal malorn trees. The shield overall resembles the shields used by the Galadriel spearmen but more advanced, as well as the shields of the Noldor elves but less advanced, being a nice midpoint between the two. The shield making these guys the perfect heavy infantry the faction would otherwise be lacking. As a unit, these guys and their officer we've seen before are the faction's closest match to the heavy infantry of Numenor and the dwarves, giving the faction a fighting chance. These guys enabling you to field a somewhat standard late game army, albeit one that is lacking in spearmen, which still supports the offensive spirit of this faction. Overall, I'd massively recommend these guys as not only do they boost the power of the faction significantly, but also help differentiate it from the Principality of Edelond, giving Lothlórien its own character. Moving on to the next unit, we have a unit that is shared by the Linden faction, that being the Noldor Infantry. These heavily armoured elves are quite atypical for this faction's playstyle, being the iconic heavy infantry of Linden seen in the opening of the Fellowship of the Ring, except in silver. Looking at their armour, they wear the classic elven helm with the spiky crest atop it, which while impractical was used by an elven warrior to kill a Balrog in battle, which gives it a pass in my mind. Looking at their body armour, they wear a mail hauberk with a rider split for some reason, over which they wear highly decorated plate cuirasses similar to those used by men-at-arms in the 16th century, some of the plate being segmented while others are solid. Attached to the cuirasses are lobstered folds to protect the upper legs, while their arms are protected by rear braces, spaulders, and lobstered van braces, mail gloves protecting their hands, their lower legs having greaves for protection. Overall, these warriors are very heavily armoured, which makes their large metal shields quite unnecessary, given that by the late Middle Ages when equivalent levels of armour existed for warriors, many chose to lay down their shields, relying on their armour to protect them, allowing them to wield far more devastating two-handed weapons better suited for killing heavily armoured foes. Looking at the shields themselves, they resemble kite shields with cutouts in the side, covered in engraved metal and with a large central boss. The closest thing to these shields being the ancient ceremonial shield used by the Celts, and kite shields. For weapons, these elves use a variety of implements, including axes with both broad and smaller heads, arming swords out of the 13th century, and warhammers with spiked backs. All these weapons being very useful in melee, although the warhammers will be the best suited for killing armoured enemies. Turning to the officer, he is identical to his troops apart from his shield, which is partially enamelled blue, and is also gilded, helping to set him apart, as does his partially gilded helmet. As a unit, these guys are pretty damn heavy infantry, being better armoured than Galadriel kin, although they aren't quite as good on the offensive. Personally, I'd recommend using these guys in late game armors to stiffen your lines somewhat, but if you want to play the faction as it's meant to be played, I wouldn't rely on them given that at that point you may as well play as Linden if you want massive armies of these guys. A very good unit, but one I caution against going overboard with. Having covered this unit, all the melee infantry of the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to their archers beginning with the Galadriel household. Also seen before in the Edelond roster, these archers are unarmoured entirely, only having their axes at their side in case of melee, as well as the Galadriel recurve bows of course, skipping the officer who's a Galadriel spearman but with a bow. These guys are your starting bowmen and as such are very useful as they're a major part of your win condition, the great range of their bows allowing them to clear the battlefield of opposing skirmishers and archers before focusing on the enemy's undefended infantry. When using them, I would caution against leaving them in the open, as they're doomed if cavalry or infantry of any sort reaches them. Useful, yes, but they should be replaced once better options become available. Speaking of better options, we have the Galadriel clan archers, who while also appearing in the Edelond roster actually have armour, using helmets and van braces. Tougher than the previous unit, their stealth capabilities make them perfect for being scattered across the battlefield shooting the enemy from multiple positions. I'd recommend massing these guys once you gain access to them and using them as the main strength of your army, focusing on cutting down the enemy cavalry first, then their ranged forces, and then their hapless infantry. Overall, a very useful unit, although keeping them safe is the name of the game as far as I'm concerned. Moving on, we come to the Galadriel March Wardens, another unit fielded by Edelond, who are essentially the bow equivalent of the Galadriel Sworn-in, being useful both in melee and as ranged forces with great range. Again, these guys will be a key component of your forces replacing your previous bow infantry, and giving you both height and firepower, and the ability to somewhat defend yourself if called out by enemy infantry. A great unit that more or less equates to the professional bowmen of other factions but with stealth capabilities that boost them ahead of the competition. Moving on to the final bow unit of the faction, we have the Galadriel Old Realm Archers, which also see service under the banner of Edelond. These archers essentially being the same as the Galadriel Kingsguard under Amdia in terms of armour, and the larger axes slung over their backs. By far the most elite archer unit fielded by the faction. These guys should be recruited as much as possible for late game armies, where when used en masse they can be used to rain arrows down on enemies before drawing their axes and crashing into weakened enemy lines. Overall, one of the best units that Galadriel have, and which exemplify their combination of brutal axemen and archers, all mixed into one excellent unit. With these guys looked at, it's time to turn to the last category of unit the faction can field, cavalry, looking at the only cavalry unit the faction has, the Galadriel Mounted March Wardens. As their name states, these are the Galadriel March Wardens mounted on unarmoured horses, using their recurve bows to act as mounted archers, sniping enemy formations and retreating before they can be caught out. As this unit is also fielded by Edelond, my criticism of it in that roster also stands here, that the bow of the Galadriel is too large to be properly wielded on horseback, with a more compact bow making more sense. However, just like before, I can excuse it as being enabled by the magic of the elves. As a unit, these guys are good for drawing out enemy units and leaving them vulnerable to ambush by your other forces, though you should be aware of the fact that they are outranged by foot archers, so they can be countered. Overall, a fairly useful unit that gives you mobility that you'd otherwise be completely lacking, raising the power of the faction quite nicely. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Kingdom of Lothlórien is a faction that I originally feared would play very similar to the Principality of Edelond. However, I was nicely surprised to find that both are quite distinct from one another. Lothlórien takes the ambush part of the equation and doubles down on it, not relying on heavy cavalry the way that Edelond does, nor having extensive lines of spearmen to protect its archers, instead relying on offensive axe infantry including some heavier varieties that are unique to them, making them that much more unique and interesting to play. Depending on your opinion, this faction might be considered the weakest on the open battlefield, though I think such a statement ignores the stealth abilities of the faction that makes it very lethal. With all that said, my breakdown of the Kingdom of Lothlórien is over, and up until a new update is released for the last Alliance Total War, this will be my last video breaking down faction rosters, although given how quickly the amazing modders work, I don't think we'll be waiting too long for a new update. That said, I'll be back soon with new videos for both this mod and the Dauntless Days, such as battle videos and army builds. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.